Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah. I'm the events manager. It's okay. Here at the store. This is really fun. I'm very excited to be doing this event. It's really nice when the event feels local and like topical and like relevant to the neighborhood history. It's a very historical neighborhood for a lot of reasons. So thank you all for being here. Blotter is the first comprehensive written account of the history of art and design of LSD blotter paper, the iconic drug delivery device that will perhaps forever be linked to underground psychedelic culture and contemporary street art. Created in collaboration with McCloud's Institute of Illegal Images, the world's largest archive of blotter art, Davis's boldly illustrated exhibition, feel free to clap, treats his outsider subject with the serious art historical respect it deserves, while also staying true to the sense of play, irreverence, and adventure inherent in psychedelic exploration. Erik Davis, congratulations on this book. For Blotter, he is an author, scholar, award-winning journalist, and teacher based in San Francisco. He's the author, most recently, of Blotter, The Untold Story of an Acid Medium, a study of LSD blotter art. He also wrote High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s, Nomad Codes, Adventures in Modern Esoterica, and the cult classic Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, which is still in print. Erik's scholarly and popular essays on music, technoculture, drugs, and spirituality have appeared in scores of books, magazines, and journals. He has spoken widely at universities, conferences, retreat centers, and festivals, and has been interviewed by CNN, the BBC, NPR, and others. He is one of the founders of Olympic, a center in Berkeley, California devoted to meditation, movement, and visionary arts and culture. It's so funny because the bar next door is called Olympic, and so it feels very cool with the parallel. And joining him tonight is McCloud, who is the head of an LSD conspiracy that gained a new generation to the cause of LSD. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Oliver said, it is a cause that creates in people the capacity to make life-threatening and life-stealing decisions. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Let's see. I don't know if I need this mic, but unless you want me. Do you want the recording words? Good. Okay.
Doesn't even sound like it.
I don't know. I can't
I don't
tell.
think his microphone's on.
It's a dead mic. It's a live mic. Doesn't matter.
I don't think it's
No, it's not on.
Is there a button? One of them has a button.
One of them has.
Yeah.
Okay.
This allows me to get close and personal.
You know, remember phones used to be like that. It's one of the many sad things about our kind of flattened, sketchy, scratchy times is the excellence of being able to talk. Like you have like you're talking to your girlfriend in high school, your parents the other room, you go, oh, I really miss you. You can't do that now. It just translates into bits. It's tedious. I'm really happy to be here at the Booksmith. I've been a resident of this neighborhood for a long time. So I've been going to the Booksmith since the beginning, since it was over there. And so I'm really happy to be in my local bookstore talking about my new book. You got a little good taste of it there. But she's right. This is in some ways, this is a very local history book. I mean, I do take the big picture and try to tell the history of LSD and the particular problem that LSD presents to the drug consumer, which is that how do you manage to control your dose of something that's so powerful at such a small amount? So you can't just like take it straight, even though of course some people did. You have to do something with it. You have to put it in something. You have to create a medium for it. And so, you know, there's a whole history of all this variety of LSD media that I partly tell in the book. Sugar cubes, liquid, hair, Pez, pieces of leather, gelatins, capsules, pills, etc., etc. But you know, the one that is most iconic is Blotter, and I call it a meta medium in a kind of silly way because from the criminal law point of view, the material that the drug is on is the carrier medium. So the sugar cube is a carrier medium for the LSD. And Blotter, just piece of paper, is the carrier medium. But the thing about Blotter, the first move in unpacking the mysteries and the wonder of Blotter as an underground media or an underground sort of print expression is that you don't need images for the drug carrier to work. You can produce, buy, sell, and consume LSD Blotter without any pictures on it. So the pictures are in some sense completely superfluous. They're sort of like, they hover above the carrier medium as this other kind of medium that is what? What are these things? Are they comic books? Are they brands, trademarks, magical sigils, motorcycle colors, religious icons, in-jokes? What are these things? And there's not really a perfectly good answer for exactly how they work, because they work in a wide variety of ways and with wide variety of implications, as you might imagine, with something like LSD. So I look at this in a lot of different ways. You know, one of the things about this project is that it was to be, not to toot my own horn, but nobody else could have really done this, because nobody else had put themselves in this strange position of like knowing, you know, media history and theory and some art history and lots of countercultural lore, you know, being, you know, fascinated with the sort of issues of technology and design, but then also spending time enough time in the underground to meet and befriend someone like Mark McCloud, who isn't just going to deal with anybody walking off the street to say, hey, yeah, let's go in and like go through your archive and make a book out of this stuff. So it was, you know, so it was really fun to be able to kind of enjoy lots of different facets of my own, you know, kind of interests and skill sets in writing the book and researching the book. You know, so there's sections on iconography and sections on connecting blotter art to trends and contemporary art. And then there's a lot of LSD history, but there's some real local stuff in the book. Not just Mark's own story, because Mark's been here forever in San Francisco, and the Institute of Illegal Images has been in its current home for, you know, decades and decades. But one of the most interesting sections of the book to research and to write, one of the parts that I'm proudest of, is about a group of blotter makers that Mark refers to as the Hayes Street Gang, and who are connected with some, you know, other characters in the scene in San Francisco over the decades. And these are people who are not in any history, not out there. Nobody knows who these people are. And the ability to resurrect some of their tales, you know, partly through tracking them down with Mark's help, partly through luck and circumstances, running into folks who were willing to talk, discovering stuff that we didn't know during the research. It was a real blast to do some primary research. You know, my other books have a lot of stuff in them, but a lot of it is just based on texts. So I'm reading other books and putting things together, reading online archives, reading magazines, et cetera, and there was some, you know, a lot of reading that went on for this too, digging through alternative newspapers, digging through a really important and fascinating DEA publication called Microgram, which is not widely available, but luckily was made available on the internet by the good folks at Arrowhead. And this fascinating document or publication was a kind of in-house newsletter circulated between the chemists and lab techs who would test drugs across the country for local police departments and for the DEA, for federal, on the federal level. And so they mostly have, and most of it's just real nerdy chemistry stuff about how to test cocaine and this and that, and different kinds of things. But the opening of the magazine, which was clearly partly named after LSD, Microgram, it was sort of a roundup of the latest interesting drugs on the street based on police seizures. And so, you know, reading through every issue over 25 years, you were able to see the development of these different formulations of LSD, but particularly Blotter, and get a sense of like, what were the first ones that they got that had printed images on them? What were the different kinds of images? Do we have records of them? And then we could cross them and say, hey, Mark, that one you have is the one that they talk about in this 1975 issue. And there's a lot that we don't know about that we'll probably never see, because, of course, another one of the interesting things about Blotter as a medium, as a print medium, like an underground comic or an alternative newspaper or something like that, is that it's designed to disappear. It's designed to leave the planet and leave no trace at all. And so it's a really fun piece. It's like the most ephemeral of psychedelic ephemera, because it's designed to go away. And yet a lot of work goes into making the images. Some of them are quite extraordinary, quite developed, that are really works of art and craft and care and love and play and creativity. And so even being able to just capture them on the fly is a work of genius. This genius in particular belonging to Mr. McCloud, who will come up here in a second. We can, pepper him with questions. And so, it's just amazing even to have this kind of archive, and to sort of rescue these images as they disappear into psychedelic experience of millions of people for decades and decades. So really quite a fun project. But what I wanted to do tonight, it really just in honor of the neighborhood and in honor of these people that are largely unknown, these unknown craftspeople, because like other periods of art history, as you may know, painters didn't sign their paintings until, let's say the early modern period, let's say the Renaissance, roughly. So you have these extraordinary medieval painters. The idea of signing their name to it doesn't even make sense. It's just not what their function is. It's not what's happening with these images. It's not being owned by an individual. And similarly, nobody's signing the blotter sheets. We don't know who most of these people are. We don't know what they were thinking, what they intended, what their story was. And so to be able to uncover some of these anonymous stories and tell their tales was really one of the most satisfying things in the book. And indeed, the most satisfying reaction I got from this book, and even though the reviews are still coming in, blah, 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 I am sure that this will be the most satisfying reaction I will receive on the book, is that there was a certain gentleman, who shall remain unnamed, who was attendant to many of the doings that are described in the section that I'm about to read. And he wanted to have nothing to do with the project. He would not confirm or deny almost anything that was mentioned, even though he was just not going to deal with it. But he was convinced to come and listen to a reading. So as we sat down, and I read him the section, and at the end, he just had a big grin on his face and nodded. And I'm like, score! So that made me really happy that at least I was getting the lore right. Whether the lore is true, we'll never know, but there's a lot of lore along with a lot of history. So I'm just going to read through this section. We'll see how far we get until we get tuckered out. The Hay Street Gang. The most storied neighborhood in the history of freakdom is Haight-Ashbury. Well, what defines a neighborhood? Stand at the fabled corner of Haight and Ashbury and face north. Walk 2 blocks and you reach the Panhandle, a long, narrow, aptly named appendage of Golden Gate Park that hosted many a bongo romp and free pancake breakfast back in the day. Keep walking north and you enter another area of spacious and once rather run-down Victorian houses. 1 block up from the Panhandle, you hit Hayes Street, whose small cluster of commercial establishments over half a century ago provided a somewhat quieter, gentler alternative for the hippies, runaways, and other funky free spirits drawn to the Haight in its heyday. By the early 1970s, Hayes Street's most venerable establishment was the Blue Unicorn. You could call it the first hippie coffee house, or more accurately, the coffee house where beatniks mutated into hippies. Founded by Bohemian refugees from North Beach, The Unicorn first opened on Frederick Street on the Haight in 1962, before moving to 1927 Hay Street in 1965. Besides boasting the cheapest Joe in town, the Unicorn served as a de facto community center, hosting poetry readings, chess meets, and gatherings of the Sexual Freedom League. It served food until the health department took too close a look at the kitchen. In the 1970s, with the general scene in decline, the Unicorn remained an informal place for acid folk to meet and coordinate what Mark McCloud calls non-obtrusive LSD behavior. Even as the coffee house went through various hands and incarnations, it continued to host this rarefied underground, which included a local crew of blotter makers, some of whom immortalized the cafe in the 1980s with a run of sheets featuring prancing blue unicorns. McCloud affectionately refers to this bunch as the Hay Street Gang, though they weren't a gang so much as a loose network of artists, printers, dealers, and esoteric freaks who hewed to the informal but Freemasonic ethos of the LSD underground. One of the earliest nodes in this blotter assemblage was Raymond Knight, who mostly went by Rocky. A gruff, imposing man from North Carolina, Rocky possessed the furious aspect of the bloodthirsty Dharma protectors pictured on the Tibetan tankas he liked to collect. He earned the handle Rocky for the intransigence he had once displayed when two armed hoods tried to pry the location of his hashish stash out of him. They shot him twice, but Rocky refused to budge. Rocky ran the Floating Lotus Gallery, a tiny storefront on Hayes that he packed with visionary art, Tibetan mandalas, and a display of his old marksmanship trophies. Rocky also cranked out some of the earliest blotter in the 1970s, those large LP-sized silkscreen sheets with big, fat hits. One standout featured a grid of labyrinths inspired by the classic Chartres design that appears prominently at San Francisco's hill-topping Grace Cathedral. Rocky also made the first sheet featuring the signs of the zodiac, which proved a popular motif over the years, in part because he kept at it, trying to iron out the mathematical discordances caused by fitting 12 astrological signs into various blotter grids. When it came to the paper, Rocky refused to work with anything other than sturdy 80-pound wood chip, preferred in part because of certain quasi-mystical ideas he held about how efficiently trees distribute water and nutrients. In time, Rocky largely left blotter production behind as he climbed into the upper echelons of the LSD world. He grew particularly tight with an acid family based in Bolinas, a remote village at the Pacific edge of Marin County that had been colonized by Bohemians. This crew was largely led by women, including Sarah Matzer, an important acid producer who spent a decade or so in the outer orbit of the Grateful Dead scene. Matzer was the person who figured out that the indentations on some fluorescent light fixtures made a perfect mold for gelatin pyramids. A gifted artist and weaver, Matzer later produced blotter based on her own designs, including an item featured in here in Mark's collection called camouflage, which is a nice camouflage image. The code word for sheets of acid in her operation was the marvelously unmacho quilts. Then there's a little discourses here about how the blotter makers related to the acid families, which is really interesting because sometimes the blotter was integrated into the main distribution network, but a lot of blotter makers also were essentially freelancers, and they would work for different families. They would work for lower level dealers who might buy, a few grams of crystal and decide, oh, I want to throw this on my own image. Hey, will you make a particular image for me? So there was all these different ways that the blotter makers interacted with the trade, and it is one of the reasons it's so various. There's so many levels at which prints were made, and if you're doing silk screens or you're using hand stamps, you can make very small amounts. If you're using an offset printer, there's a kind of minimum amount to make it economically viable, but it just means that there was just tons and tons of blotter that we'll never know about, we'll never see. So Hay Street had plenty of room for the artisan approach, represented by probably one of my favorite characters in the book, Tony Smith, a blotter maker whom everyone called Forrester. He was from an accomplished East Coast family that was at once bohemian and genteel. His mother, Suzanne Bloch, taught lute and harpsichord at Juilliard and would sometimes perform in Renaissance costume. Suzanne's father was the composer Ernest Bloch, whose singular compositions were saturated with his Jewish heritage. Her sister was good friends with Frida Kahlo. Forster's father, Paul Smith, chaired Columbia University's mathematics department and made important contributions to geometric topology, a rather psychedelic subfield devoted to intertwinkled manifolds. One friend of the family was Albert Einstein, who sometimes played violin poorly with Suzanne. During one Forrest outing, little Forrester peed on the great man's shoulders. This is confirmed by his son, by Forrester's son. Paul's status didn't help Forrester when the young man was busted selling a nickel bag of cannabis on the Columbian campus. Forrester was already experienced at this point, having been turned on by no less an august figure than Timothy Leary, who dropped a sugar cube on his tongue during a peace march in 1967. After the weed bust, Forrester hijacked the family station wagon and drove west until the car broke down and he hitched the rest of the way to San Francisco. Landing in the Haight, he immersed himself in the scene, becoming what his later business partner, Neil Benedict, which is his pseudonym, called a hippie in the true digger style. He studied metaphysics and numerology, baked bread to give away, and lived in the family circus commune on Oak Street, where he had a kid with a witch woman and who then took off. He got into screen printing and opened a shop at 1943 Hay Street, eventually called Gill Feather Graphics, which made posters, t-shirts, signs, and greeting cards. Forster loved the outdoors, hence the nickname, and he named the shop after the road where his family had their country home, back in Vermont, where Forster once worked as a fire lookout, and a gill feather is a kind of local turnip. Benedict, Forster's printing partner, was a younger man who didn't get to San Francisco until 1972. By that point, the bloom was definitely off the hippie rose. Arriving as a teenager from the north woods of Wisconsin, Benedict found the Haight almost post-apocalyptic. With a background in theater and media, Benedict was primed for the still bubbling underground print scene and enrolled in the graphic design program at San Francisco City College. Later, he got a job at a pivotal black community newspaper run out of Fillmore, which he did not want me to name the newspaper or its publisher, which is fine, because he had so much respect for them and these guys who gave him a job. And they also did printing for grassroots political campaigns and the Black Panthers. Benedict was one of the few white guys who worked there doing darkroom tech, layout, and paste up, skills he would later bring to Gillfeather. Benedict apprenticed with Forster, and together the two men refined the art of silk screening. So that's one of the main forms that blotters made, usually on a somewhat smaller scale. They moved within a milieu of serious acid folk, but from Benedict's perspective, the decision to start making blotter grew out of their craft enthusiasm rather than any criminal aspirations. It seemed like a good little side project, Benedict says today, a great DIY kitchen sink operation that anyone could do. There never was a master plan. Maybe somebody else had one, but from my point of view, it was just like, oh, here's another order to fill. Though LSD had been a profound spiritual teacher to Benedict, he did not share the acid evangelism that drove some producers and distributors, and he wasn't pleased with the drift towards the disco hits. I considered LSD a sacrament, and at a certain point, it was no longer sacred. Talking to Benedict was really fascinating because he wasn't bitter at all. Sometimes older bohemians get super bitter, and he wasn't bitter, but he was definitely not nostalgic, and had a really clear-eyed view of the scene and his own participation in it, which he was proud about, but he also felt it kind of derailed his artistic aspirations. He just got so caught up with it, and it became this whole thing. I'm not going to tell that whole story here. You can buy the book. But we're going to move on to some other characters. Then there is the matter of the pyramid. Here's a sheet of one of the pyramids. You can see it's tiny little eye in the triangle pyramids. A number of blotters coming out of Hay Street in the early years featured featured flat cut-along triangles. Cut-alongs meaning before the perforation became popular, so the perforation would guide the way you divided up the sheet. You would just get unperforated sheets, and you had to cut them yourself. And so a lot of the function of the imagery on the paper was to guide your hand. So sometimes they would print grids, that's an easy one. But some of them, as far as we can tell, were elaborate, sometimes elaborate nested triangles, where you could kind of like get more or less, I mean, it gets kind of esoteric even in the geometry of the way the sheets were laid out. These pyramids you would instantly recognize as such because they were decorated with eyes. Right there. It's a mystical book, Mother, Daughter, Murder Night. Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah. The most haunting of these was Horus, which featured an Egyptian eye of Horus inside a triangle, initially gold and in a later edition black on beige. Acting like a hyperlink hidden in the Institute archive, Horus in turn invokes another enigmatic character from those years, Manny Vogel, another pseudonym, a whip-smart gay man from New Jersey who lived for a time in a converted cab dispatch garage near Polk Street, San Francisco's original queer neighborhood. A generous fellow, fond of disguises, the owner of numerous hippie crash pads, Manny was an acid lord who sold a lot of loaded blanks, but also contributed to the Hay Street publishing effort. Manny was also a serious occultist. He studied Aleister Crowley and collected books on metaphysics, Rosicrucianism, and Kabbalistic lore, as well as many a tome of actual chemistry. He claimed to use occult methods and maybe even sex magic to enchant the chocolate pyramid confections he made and sold, which were so heavily dosed with cannabis that it probably didn't make much difference one way or the other. Manny also served as the master of the Pyramid Club, an underground gathering of heads, mystics, and pansexuals that likely gave Manny the opportunity to break out the Masonic robes and props he also collected. For a while, the Pyramid Club met at an occult bookstore Manny ran in the Lower Haight before he decided he didn't want it anymore and simply gave it back to its original owner. Note on original owner, there were a lot of weird synchronicities in writing this book. Usually, my experience writing books is always kind of a synchronicity honey trap. And some of these characters ended up being people I knew in a totally other context. So the owner of this bookstore was somebody I had been buying occult books from since the 1990s. And so I was able to talk to him, and once I made that connection, because I asked him about the Pyramid Club, he goes, oh God, da, da, da. Then there was all this other information that came from him that I didn't know about, that Mark didn't know about. So there were a number of characters like that that provided some really interesting information, as did Terrence McKenna's ex-wife, Kathleen Harrison, who I was just telling the project to. And she goes, oh yeah, I know this, oh you don't know, blah, blah, blah. And it was a whole other character that Mark and I hadn't identified, and had his whole story, and we were able to put it together. So there's some really nice coinky-dinks that happened along the way. So I'm talking about this Pyramid Club and the pyramid on the blotter. But despite all this pyramid power, the actual image that inspired Horus may have had far more quotidian origins. Benedict insists that the icon was whipped up by a gill feather artist who specialized in commercial logos. But there's another story. On the other hand, another friend of Manny's points to the retail sign of Pyramid Liquor, a store that Manny frequented out on Geary. That's the thing about some mysteries. They reverberate all the way down to the banal. And that kind of funniness around the pyramid, where you're like, where does the pyramid come from? Oh, it's esoteric Egypt, it's part of the occult underground. Well, maybe it's actually just a sign on a liquor store the guy liked to go to. That tension is, to me, like the key takeaway of LSD iconography and symbology. It's this playful flip-flop between the sacred and the profane, between the transcendental and the banal. And there's a tension and a confusion and a goofy play between these poles that, to my mind, is like the gateway into the particularly LSD kind of mysterium, and in a way that's unlike other major psychedelics, I believe, because of the way that acid is bound up with the machinery of modernity in a way that obviously mushrooms and ayahuasca.
Robert Anton Wilson, Atlantean definition of it.
That's right. That's right. You have the whole Illuminatus thing, and so it just keeps going.
Operation Mindfuck.
Operation Mindfuck, and what would be a mindfuck without a little LSD? Let's see. Okay, so yeah, we're going to get to one other character, and then we'll bring up Mark himself. Benedict and Forrester were also acolytes of the freak occultism that was intertwined with Bay Area psychedelia and, to a degree, San Francisco's innovative sex culture. Forrester read widely in witchcraft and Eastern mysticism and used his Atari 800, an early personal computer, to investigate numerology in the early 1980s. Benedict, turned off by the myriad of newly minted spiritual groups that wanted to, quote, reinvent the taco, immersed himself instead in the theosophy and Rosicrucianism of an earlier generation. The two men's esoteric interests informed their handicraft as well. Studying Kabbalah and hieroglyphs, they came to believe in a language of symbols that informed their work on underground logos. And they also owed their friendship to one of the most curious mystagogues of the Haight Street era, an enigmatic and notoriously corpulent friend of Manny's known as the Electric Buddha. Born Richard Duran, the Buddha was from a small town in Idaho where his father worked as a pharmacist. He was an awkward young man and fled home to join the army. He lived in Germany, then New York in the late 1950s, and ran a bookstore in Portland before moving to San Francisco. The Buddha was already on the scene during the Summer of Love, and he was listed on the masthead of Vanguard, the monthly magazine of a local gay liberation youth organization. His role in the publication, according to the masthead, phallic symbol. In Amazing Dope Tales and Haight Street Flashbacks, Stephen Gaskin describes the Buddha as a mind power guru and methadone freak who vowed to shoot speed until he either attained enlightenment or destroyed his soul. A good friend of Manny's, Duran ran crash pads and performed as sage and guiding light, especially to the unmoored young men he often wound up sheltering and loving. Benedict was one of these young men, and he became enamored with the Buddha's vibe, part esoteric hierophant and part mother hen. Benedict served as the steward at one of his crash pads, keeping the place as clean and uncrazy as possible. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the interesting ins and outs of the Buddha, including his role in a fascinating underground magazine called Astral Stains on Paper, which is a super weird, wonderful kind of, it's like it runs from like the mid to the late 70s to the early 80s, so you can just sort of, going through the pages, you see the scene mutate from like, grotty, post Summer of Love hippie-dom into like new wave, you start seeing like little new wave punk, Dada kind of stuff coming in. It's very interesting. I mean, the late 70s is a very weird, fascinating time in San Francisco and much understudied. So I go and talk about that a little bit, but since we're on the topic, Manny and the Electric Buddha were not the only men straddling San Francisco's gay scene and the city's acid underground. As is clear to anyone familiar with the psychedelic antics of the Coquettes or the Angels of Light, legendary freak drag performance crews of the high and holy hippie days, these worlds were once so tightly entwined that they were effectively indistinguishable. Very important to remember this. Very important to remember this. The whole way that like gay culture is sort of separated and essentialized in San Francisco history is this thing that's happening in Castro, You take it back a notch, and it's just all one great exploration of weirdness and eroticism. As one longtime San Francisco cannabis queer put it, the first gays were hippies. By the 1980s, some of the most delightful pieces of blotter art came, this is our last figure for the evening, coming out of San Francisco were from the decidedly queer hand of Shep Mishkin, a jokester and love-bombing pothead known on the street as Grandpa. Jewish and probably from the East Coast, Mishkin kept his cards close to his chest, even among friends. Grandpa lived for a while at the Castro Castle, a communal house run by cannabis activist Dennis Perone, who has also very much enjoyed his LSD. Both men were galvanized by the city's AIDS crisis, with Grandpa joining a local aid agency that cared for the terminally ill called the Shanti Project. He also helped Perone establish the Cannabis Buyers Club, the seed crystal of the medical marijuana movement. Gilbert Baker was another friend and fellow Castro communard, the celebrated creator of the LGBT add on the letters rainbow flag. Gilbert received his vision, this is a nice little bit of local lore, for the now global banner while high on acid and glitter at a San Francisco nightclub. So just imagine this young man dancing away, glitter, acid, the rainbow! It's great. Years later, Grandpa issued a blotter based on Baker's flag, which is included in the book. Lots of old school blotter hits were physically large. Michigan was the first seriously to shrink, the first to seriously shrink the size of the hits. The smallest perfs in the III collection are a run of his tiny diamonds, printed on very thin cardstock and resembling glittering snowflakes. Ink load was a consideration behind the size reduction, as was discretion. Michigan was also drawn to the ludic power of cartoon characters on blotter, but didn't just steal them from the funny pages. One of the things I talk a lot about in the book is how much just straight up appropriation and stealing goes on in the blotter iconography. People are just taking cartoons from anywhere, but it happened even a little less than you think. Like there's a very famous late 70s Mickey Mouse blotter as the Sorcerer's Apprentice, but if you look at the image and then go through all the Disney archive, that image doesn't appear. So somebody actually produced the Sorcerer's Apprentice image that they wanted for the blotter. So it's kind of interesting. It's not just like expediency. Something else is going on with the appropriation. But Michigan made up his own. One is called Pink Flamingos, which features cartoon birds in human costume, including a cowboy with chaps and a leather daddy brandishing a whip. It's kind of like the Village People blotter. Michigan was also responsible for dancing test tubes. You can't really see it, but this is the test tubes thing. Whose cavorting cartoon vials paid homage to the mascot of Farm Chem Research Foundation, a nonprofit Menlo Park lab that tested anonymous submissions of street drugs and made the data publicly available. So that's actually another interesting thing about blotter is that it features a lot of kind of in-jokes and inner scene references. So anybody who was familiar with PharmChem, which was the first anonymous drug testing operation in the country, in the world as far as we know, such a great service, and they would, I just found out that they would put the information on the radio. So KSAN, so you get like a number, you submit your thing, you say, okay, you're number 33, and then a couple days later you go, okay, the PharmChem rundown, number 33, you have yourself some fine LSD. So he was honoring this by taking their little sigil that came on their ads. So we include one of their ads here. There's a little dancing test tube figure, and then just elaborated that to describe the blotter. So there's a lot of that in the blotter. So they really operate like kind of like windows into all of these different currents, many of which we don't know. Even though Mark's been gathering these stories for decades and people have been bringing him tales and material, there's a lot of stuff we don't know as well. And it's part of the fun of it. I mean, there's like tons of information in this book, but it's also just like kind of a guess, kind of just a stab at something that by its very nature doesn't really leave a trace. And that's part of what's kind of awesome about it, sort of, especially now with like so much visibility around psychedelics, and they inevitably lose some of the esoteric, underground, mysterious, kind of subcultural vibe to them. And this material just is just inevitably kind of soaked in it, literally. And I think with that, let's bring Mark McCloud up here. Usually I have a slideshow, and it was really nice not to have a slideshow so I could just read, because I worked really hard on the prose, and the images kind of overwhelming, but so thank you for just letting me read it. So how you doing, Mark?
Okay.
How you feeling about the project? What do you think?
Good. It's good to get it this far.
Yeah.
So back at home on 8th Street.
Yeah.
One of my favorite Booksmith releases was Ray Manzarek, a company organ playing to the Doors book.
That's right.
It was here across the street.
Yeah, they've had some great readings. William Gibson.
The who used to come here all the time to score our the finest English publisher of art books, Sir Edward Booth Clifford's books, which, may rest in peace, we'll never find another quality art book maker like that. He started with like bag one for John Lennon.
Oh, okay.
And worked his way up to knighthood.
Okay, there we go.
Because his Damien Hirst book was like the last big
Yeah.
when he died. He died right after 9/11 happened.
Here's a question for you. So as you can tell, Mark is into art. He taught art, he taught sculpture, he made sculpture, did lots of photography. He's definitely an art-soaked freak. And later, as I tell the story in the book, ended up making a lot of blotter himself for the underground. Can you talk a little bit about how your work as a blotter maker carried forward your artistic interests and aspirations?
No, it was very similar to my sculpture, I thought. It was just a way of staying in the same field. But when the East Village disappeared, I moved to Psychedelic Solution, which was, just up the block a little bit. And then I switched to smaller format, which was the Great American, the smallest billboard in the world.
Blotter, the smallest billboard in the world.
Yeah. And so then, but the rules were pretty much the same, And I've never had a problem distinguishing them.
Did you feel that part of your decision to start collecting blotter back in the early 80s was because you were like, hey, this stuff is art, but it's not really gets to be seen as that?
I was extremely attracted to miniature things anyway my whole life.
Stamps, coins,
Yeah, I was heavy into philately and numismatism.
There we go.
And I also had an ant farm, with 8 of the most beautiful ants you've ever seen in life.
I have never heard about the ant farm.
Yeah, and, you could tell the ants from each other. They had
Names? Did they have names?
Personalities.
Did you name the individual ants?
Yeah, so I was always interested in photographing the minuscule.
I didn't know that either. So what you do like close-up stuff?
I failed tremendously for a long time. So
It's hard.
Well, yeah, you have to work your way up to photographing an ant.
Yeah. And part of the fun of doing this book is that there's all these blotters in Mark's collection, but we didn't have to get them all scanned because he had already done a lot of them for a variety of art books that he's done with
Also, if
blotters.
you're going to be acquitted of a huge crime, you want to have better forensic photos than the DEA.
Yes, Mark here is referring to some of the
So my
run-ins you've had.
My battles with the DEA, so I had the highest, at that point,
So
highest definition of imagery you could find.
Right. So the summit, what's nice about that is, see if I can find an image, is that some of these pictures, they're just like a single hit that's blown up real big, so you can get all the like fur of the edges. So these are like blown up, and Mark did these excellent scans, and one of your books is a big blotter book, and it's like this big. So it's like, you get this like one big hit, it's like this big. It's a total fun play of scale. Yeah, 4 ways and single hits, and so it's a fun play with scale. Hey, I was thinking, since I talked so much about the Hay Street Gang, how about telling a little bit of the story of how did you meet these? How did you get initiated this way?
It's a miracle. But Mr. Natural is still alive and up the block there. The Mr. Natural that was the model for the actual cartoon guy. But he taught music school there on Hay Street. I bet you could still get us a class.
Yeah.
And some of the Tuxedo Moon studied there, and then the invertebrates. I don't know if you remember that band. But I met, he left a card at my first exhibit of Blotter at the Art Institute saying if you want if I wanted to meet some of the artists, to please get in touch with them.
Which you did.
Yes.
Right,
And,
right.
you know, he was definitely the one of the few unarrested members of the history gang, you know, and you know, still there as well. And so then, as I met the other guys, Forrester was going up the river for 10 years, and there was going to obviously be a big shortage of blotter paper, and I proposed that you know, they let me take that up for them, and after, you know, they made me swim in the ocean and fight them out, and kill the dragon and free the maiden, and then they let me have the job, and I got to finish all of what Forrester had been interrupted at, and then go to my own source of
Right.
material.
Yeah. Which also carried on some of those witty
Yeah,
in-jokes.
We set up a perf machine on Page Street, you know, right there next to the record store off of there, Roy Loney's old record store there. And it was in the basement. It was a huge press at that point, but we were doing 1,000 blocks. And you know, just thought it's there. And we reinitiated it, so when, you know, Forrest went away, there wasn't really a big shortage of blotter, which there would have been. It was hard to get anyway at that point, in the late 80s. You would often buy a gram and it would come with no paper.
Right, because sometimes when people would buy, they'd get the crystal, but they'd also get the paper to put it on.
Sure.
Right.
And then a lot of it was blank, you know. There was a huge distributor that always used a shamrock shake colored paper. And he was the genius guy that had figured out how to get the starter out of the Hawaiian wood rose. And so then he had this huge production every year until they caught him. And it was always on a blank shamrock shaped paper.
So the first time you were busted, it was part of a DEA operation that targeted the Grateful Dead scene called Operation Looking Glass. And after this rather clownish attempt to convict you, that it was so ridiculous that the judge just threw it out before it was even.
What it was the informant. When the informant got busted, he didn't want to turn in his friend that had sold him the acid, and so he threw me in because I had done the cover of the 5th publication of his little book company called Psychedelic Monographs and Essays. He felt I had earned the privilege of being thrown at the DEA as the source of supply instead of his boyfriend. So it wasn't even my dog the first time.
Well, what I was thinking about, the reason I brought it up is so after
you couldn't say, hey, it wasn't my dog.
But is that you responded to this. The next blotter art that you made was
Well, yeah, Alice moving through
the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of like pokey, funny, like you have to know the tale, but if you know the tale, there's a whole other level to what you're looking at.
But art's that way, you know, it intersects with your life in a way you'll never really be able to separate it.
Well, it's 8 o'clock, so let's just, with Casey here breaking the ice, let's just open up to Q&A.
Mark, is Alice, your Alice through the Looking Glass, the first double-sider?
Oh,
Double-sided, I'm fine.
no, not really. I can remember a leopard, a beautiful leopard coming out of Santa Cruz by that
Side
genius
one.
that would make them look, he would make them look like hand stamps, but they were printed. And he'd make them look like hand stamps, so when they got captured, it looked like a smaller operation. But he would do leopards on the front and then their paws on the back sometimes.
And the other brilliant one that I think you might be credited with is the 9-panel Jesus, with the Jesus on one side and the 9-panel.
Yeah, but that's so that you don't have to break up a Jesus to complete the
Straight up.
graph.
You can't still break up the other one.
You
Jesus on
break,
one side.
yeah, you don't fracture the image. You
Yes.
know. You need 11 900s and an extra 100 hits to complete a graph. You know.
Or just
And
make
I
it
didn't
one
want
way.
to break up a Jesus to complete the graph, so I made little 100 black Jesuses to complete the graph
Yes.
and maintain the magical
I love it.
element.
I love it. I think it's
And
Dallas and that two are the
and
most
that's how
iconic
you-
sheets of all
You
time.
know, that's the special attention required in making
Yeah.
a transport of something you're going to imbibe in. You want it to be solid in its concept. You don't want it to insult the substance.
Christian,
So I see you're sitting in front of the mystery section, so I'm just thinking, was there a big mystery that
Yeah.
you didn't solve in the book? Because there's many little mysteries.
Tons.
But can you reflect on one of the
Any
big
collector knows that their lot list is much bigger than their have list.
Yeah, right.
You know. And so then there's tons of questions.
I think one is we don't know who first did perforation.
The first perfor has stepped forward and said, oh, yeah.
That's me, I did that. You know, we still don't really know what the first printed one is because you just don't, there's a couple different somewhat contradictory signs. It looks like it's likely that it was a Mr. Natural, but it might have been something else. Somebody might have, ripped the illustration from a book and just dosed that. Does that count? And so, it gets kind of fuzzy. And then I think we also don't know who innovated, the early blotters were still made with drops, either hand drops or machines that would drop like a pin on it so that the single drop was attached. And at some point someone said, why don't we just dip the whole piece of paper?
Yeah, right.
paper? That we don't know anything about as far as
We don't know.
Around what year was that?
Huh?
Who invented the Ziploc method?
Well, I think that's, the necessity, the mother of invention.
necessity. We can,
The deadline's right there.
So
You get it.
what he's referring to is the thing is that if you know your paper and you know the absorption rate of your paper and you do the math right, you can actually put many sheets into a Ziploc bag and fill it with the right amount of material, and it will evenly, and shake it up, and it will evenly absorb. So you can do a lot pretty
Yeah,
quickly.
it's really just.
You had a comment,
Yeah, what's the relation with, like, tablets and window pane and blotter? Were they all out at the same time? I
No,
never saw blotter.
the differences are tremendous,
Yeah.
huge,
It's definitely, it unfolds over time. So tap in this, with those ones talking, tablets are first, so Owsley's making tablets.
Broken bag of Quaaludes,
And they they're real strong, and they stay strong until the mid-70s, but their quality gets much worse. And so you start seeing gelatins around 1970, the first clear lights appear then. At that point, there might be a few people who are distributing blotter. There's some blotter from the late 1960s that come out of New York City, but it remains a minority vehicle until about the mid-70s, but by the end of the decade, it's the dominant one. So it comes a little late, which is part of what's interesting about the iconography, because the iconography is kind of basically post-hippie. It's not celebrating the summer of love, it's more punk rock, Dada, subculture, heavy metal. So it's an interesting medium because it comes later than those.
And it shows the spread
Yeah.
to other cultures.
Yeah,
Did you
totally.
did you tell the Beresford Hollingshead icing sugar story?
No, missed out on that
About
one.
that one?
Just, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, because we might mention the underwear. Soaking
Yeah,
up-
we mentioned the underwear.
Yeah, we mentioned the underwear soaking up the spill. But, we didn't go all the different.
Yeah, there's a lot. We could have kept going. Yes, sir.
When window pane came out around 1970,
Yeah.
did it have a longer shelf life than the blotter?
Yes, because of the construct of it. My entire gel collection wasn't returned by the DEA after my acquittal because they claimed it was all alive still. and it makes sense. It's captured within two walls of sometimes ultraviolet coated material that will prevent the penetration of UV. And so then it stays active much longer time than exposed paper. But you know, if you put your head in a book, a thick book, it'll cut off the UV and the oxygen for a long time, you know. And so the demise of it is a lot slower than people suppose.
Well, I
But
thought I had a lecture.
ALD doesn't disintegrate, and you go ISO, like LSD 25, you know, so then if your stuff was ALD dipped, it's still alive. It's still good. Like those little wood stocks that were Scully's solution to the acid problem, you know, was ALD, you know, and he got away with it a few times. And, then they put that on the list to prosecute. But his first, you know, his first acquittals are because he had used the LP instead of an LSD. One of the tricks was he made the pill capsule itself, the transparent pill capsule, out of LSD, and the content totally blank.
I didn't know that one. That would have been in the book.
Capture the pill and open it up and analyze it, go, there's nothing.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Who did that? Scully?
Yeah,
Oh man, that's great.
and that was a good way around it for a while till they caught on. A lot of it is that you know, there was a Canadian shoestring that was a blotter for a long time. And it was striped. The stripes.
Yes, in the back.
What do we know about the individual chemists that provided the raw material? Apart from the names that we know, but
As you know, Casey will tell you,
I have,
that varies a lot also, you know.
is there a handful, or, 'cause Eric mentioned the LSD
There's-
families, I've never heard that expression before.
Yeah, there's more every day.
thankfully, because we want to spread the light.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's,
There's more people interested in manufacturing psychedelics every day.
But what about 50 years ago?
You know,
I can tell you
plenty.
what the DEA
Nick
believed.
was self-taught, for example, my last co-conspirator, which he was totally self-taught. He didn't have a worthwhile education.
I thought he was helped along by Oxley, is that not true?
Yeah, you know, there was a
Well,
course.
self-taught meaning also
Yeah,
just
but,
like
you know,
not, he
Owsley-
was not a chemist.
Until his death, you could spend $100,000 and get the private course from Mr. Owsley. And it demanded 2 weeks of your life, and you had to go to Australia and spend 2 weeks learning it at the cost of 100 frog pelts. And many people did that.
Yeah,
A
it's,
worthwhile thing.
for, you know, for the purpose of this project, I actually kind of bracketed that.
That's a
because it's
secret.
so complicated, and so much more gnarly, and so much more lore, so much more hard to figure out. But I can tell you that the DEA was under the impression that most of the labs were in Northern California, that a relatively small number of crews kept producing over a long period of time, like a long period of time. Some of them probably more or less today, meaning, you know, it's going to be a changing of the guard, but the basic operation, because there were extremely low number of busts. And why there was a low number of busts is actually worth thinking about, because it gets you into another really key element of the whole LSD industry, which is that it's significantly not like other illegal drugs, even other psychedelics. Because you do need to know what you're doing to make it. You do need to spend a lot of money on gear, and it's you know, you gotta be hiding well. But more importantly than that, most of the people who are doing it, while you can make good money, and there are definitely people who would just do it once, they had the skills, they'd buy the gear, they'd make a batch, they'd make a a mill and they were done. Like that definitely happened. But a lot of people kept at it because they, more than just it was fun to be a criminal or that they wanted to break the law or they just wanted to make a lot of money for not working for the man, they had an investment in the belief of spreading the love and the light. But that means that the people who worked under them had those values too, which means if those people got busted, they would rat. And they wouldn't rat not just because they didn't want to be, I mean, they had like actual strong, almost like a religious value, like, why would I ever rat? I got selected by karma, here we go, I'm going to do my time. And so that actually was one of the reasons that it remains largely untouched over the decades, with a few important exceptions.
So you're referencing the chemist in Picard's book?
That would be one of the great exceptions. You know, all of that, and you know, and that I mean, Mark can say more about that situation.
I didn't understand what you said.
Can you explain?
Well, he just brought up Picard as an example of a bust that we all.
Well, not so much his bust, but the chemist in his
Lenin
book.
was busted many times.
The mystical
He didn't,
chemist.
just
Yeah,
get busted.
he's talking about the chemist.
You know,
Yeah.
Leonard's fantasy, all his chemists.
Oh, and it's
His
Rosa
mystical,
Paracelsus.
his friends.
Rosa Paracelsus book.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that, that's, probably not including the Dutch cooks. I don't know.
Definitely not saying that.
It's more of a allegory. Being from Borges's background, Buenos Aires, where the Rosa Paracelsus title came from, it's much larger than the portrayed symbol of the Universal Library. So I imagine that it's all true. You're mentioned in there, I'm sure.
Do you have a fun pseudonym in there?
I think we're mentioned next week, actually. Right?
Could be.
Okay.
And
No, I don't have
yeah, yeah, but in case he'd had the first hemp paper to get popped, and it was that Mind States 2004, was it?
Yeah, the image was 2001.
I should have emphasized it.
Stevie Postman's brain image,
So,
Lotus brain
yeah,
image,
230.
and it was hemp paper, which is nice, except it takes like an hour to load that puppy. It's the oil on the paper rejects all the sauce,
Turn it over.
then you're sitting around, what's that?
Well, yeah, no, the blotter, turn it over, the ink doesn't stop again through.
So we're talking about,
The hemp paper, slow. A lot of people don't heat their paper before they load it, so that's what you get.
you're gonna get some tricks now, folks. You might wanna be taking notes.
Heat the paper?
You don't have to pay $100,000 for
Get
this.
all the water out of your paper, and then it's even Steven, and
211?
powerful
That wasn't
everywhere.
230. There we go. So this is the one, so ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are purchasing this fine item tonight and collecting signatures for that magic future day when the values increase, please take advantage of the presence today of Casey Hardison and get him to sign page 211, where he makes a comment about the piece of the sheet that he was busted with, not his own creation, but one that played an important role in his unfortunate bust in the United Kingdom. So
It's funny about it, the paper didn't play such a role in the fund.
Right, that's right.
The paper played a role in the attempt for them to extract funds back out of me for how much money I might have made from the proceeds of crime.
That's right, that's right. So that, yes?
Yes, so with the acceptance, or the more acceptance of microdosing now, which has at this point been 10 years, and mescaline is now being introduced as a legitimate therapeutic, it seems society is moving for the just general acceptance of psychedelics.
Well, if we've got to start testing LSD again from the beginning, and forget the 50 years of experience that we've got, I'm all for it. I'll go with it. You've got to start again tomorrow like it's the first time.
But in your,
Okay,
in your
that's what
book
it
tour,
takes.
what-
But for 50 years we've been trying it, I think the results are in. We can all pretend that we didn't use the scientific method and stuff.
Anecdotal,
Anecdotal, that's all anecdotal.
But I think the word's already cleared the substance, you know?
In your book tour, you probably have a general feeling of societal attitudes and stuff.
If
Oh, yeah, it's
we wait
definitely
for the
changed.
society, we're never gonna catch the bus. That's for sure.
We're on it.
Yeah, it's definitely opened up, and it's also like, you know, what is a microdose? How does that compare to how people were
Yeah,
tripping
if
in the
you
late
don't like the
1960s?
boss, you do the microdose. If you like the boss, you macrodose. Give it all you can.
But one thing about microdose, whether or not, I mean, LSD is going to be one of the last, because there, you know, as we've seen, there have been movements to legalize nature. So natural psychedelics are easier for our world right now to imagine because they symbolically represent the world outside of modernity, the world of indigeneity, the world of the pre-modern past that still has some charm to it and some hope of improving our collapsing civilization. But because acid comes out of that collapsing civilization just at an earlier phase, and because it was the drug of the counterculture, it has the most negative associations with it. So it's probably going to be the last one that kind of really gets taken up. There's other reasons too, like if you're a therapist and you want to charge for a psychedelic session, psilocybin, you're in and out, 4 hours, 5 hours. LSD, that's a long day, it's an expensive day. So it's kind of interesting how, but one thing about the microdosing thing and the popularity among tech workers or whatever is that it guarantees a steady supply of nerdy clean LSD. So it's in that sense, even on the underground, it has changed the supply because there's like people like, oh, let's make microdoses. Okay, let's make gelatins, and like so there's all this weird good acid out that wasn't there 20 years ago in the same way. There was still good acid. There's always been, most of the time there's been some good acid out there, but there's like a focus on it because there's like a demand among nerds. And nerds are good at making drugs.
I'd just like to make a point about that.
Oh, sure.
I'm kind of old school with the microdosing thing.
Yeah.
My mom and my aunt were friends with Osley, and I did all the really pure stuff.
They must have been cute, because they
before I
only had
reached
cute friends.
March King's son.
Before I reached puberty.
Yeah.
So my feeling now, I'm also a retired PhD clinical psychologist, is that this resurgence in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, there's a lot of pathology out there that needs treating. And if more people would take a heroic dose of the really pure stuff and reset their spiritual compass to the true north, there wouldn't be the pathology that needs treating.
That is the voice of the old school, and so that what's become sad about the microdosing fad and the way people are taking it up is it just seems like it's sort of like the metaphor of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's like, oh, I can microdose and I get a little more squeaky clean in this direction, and well, what are you really doing? But I was going to say,
velocity, there's no
well, I think that's one of the things about our current psychedelic movement is that many things are happening at the same time. So there is a secular psychotherapeutic development of pharmaceuticals, treatments that might be covered by insurance, and there is an explosion of psychedelic religion, some of them based on, peculiar syncretic religions from the jungle, some of them invented nouveau, some, connecting with like deep religious currents, which are, it's quite different language than the other one. And then you have people in between, more and more folks just kind of going, whatever these things are, they're learning tools, and at some point in your, which is how I look at them, is that they're like forms of learning, and you, in that process, at some point, you're going to go big. It's just, you're not going to just, because you can only learn so much from small. So it's like, there's all these different ways that people are taking them and thinking about them. So what I've come to, because for a while I was like, grumpy man with all the new stuff, and I was like, oh god, these kids today, they don't know what they're talking about. I'll tell you a story about that, you know, whatever. And then I was like, that's not a good look. I'm going to stop that. So now it's more like just like get focused and support what you think is cool now. And just not really worry about the other stuff because everything's happening at once, and how it's going to come out is really hard to say.
The best portrayal of the future is done by the geniuses that did the movie Wild in the Streets, in which the 14-year-olds are given the vote, and we immediately replace everybody over 30 has to do 2 weeks of LSD camp if they want to vote. You know?
I love that, like giving the 14-year-olds the vote.
Yeah, and it's highly recommended.
Which reminds me, just like
that's the solution, is you give the,
I don't want to talk
make everyone aware.
I don't.
If they want to vote, they have to do the full 2 weeks of acid camp.
No exceptions to acid camp.
They take Shelley Winters off screaming to it. But it was really the solution to all our problems.
Wild in the Streets.
Wild in the Streets, yeah. 1967.
Excellent.
The music in it's so excellent that I bet we could use some of it during this coming vote.
Speaking of which, that's the thing I want to say. It just was so outrageous. Apparently, our potential future Vice President J.D. Vance had suggested at one point that children should get a vote, like even little kids, that their parents get to control. So like if you have 5 kids, you get like 7 votes. Your family gets 7 votes, so that, you know, families would have more of an input on the future of the country.
The movie's
Isn't
got
that
the
fucking
first starring role by Richard.
And there's no
Pryor,
acid in that
you know,
vision, you
and
know.
Richard plays the
Richard who?
Richard Pryor.
Oh yeah.
He plays the psychedelic congressman from California.
Richard Pryor's in Wild in the Streets?
Of course.
Oh my Lord. I didn't know that. Yeah, he is.
We're so
What you saw up here?
I have it.
I am it, or I have it? I like I am it. You are Wild in the Streets.
No, that's a masterpiece. You couldn't buy the trip without it.
Right.
When the DVD world.
I like one more question.
Yeah. We'll take. We've got the word. One more question. Anybody got a burning queue out there? Hasn't asked a question.
What's the first acid movie? Do you know?
The Trip.
No. Come on. Chappaqua. You don't even know what
Oh, I
it
did.
is.
Aqua.
Yeah.
1960. That's like 60.
Great
Our
sound.
friend William Burroughs playing Cappy Hubbard
Yep.
at the Chappaqua Clinic, Chappaqua, New York. And if you don't know it, why so?
Great
Soundtrack by Ravi Shankar.
Okay.
It's true.
Wake up.
It's true. It's out there. It's out there. You can find it. You gotta dig a little bit for it, but it's good. I've seen that one.
William Burroughs playing Cappy Hubbard. Where are you gonna get that?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing.
My aunt made a movie in 1965, a year before that, called The Psychedelic Experience.
Oh,
which is
yeah,
actually
yeah.
by Timothy Leary, and the soundtrack by Robert Shankar.
Yeah.
Because he was dating Paul Rocker, Robert Shankar's album player.
Your aunt being on partner.
Keith Millay.
That's right. I've seen that
Mayo
movie.
Millay.
Yes, I've seen
Her last name was Mayo.
Yeah. I got to meet her and I saw that film, which is very hard to find. Like I saw a screening of it. And
It's online.
oh, it is now, because it wasn't the last time I looked, and I looked a couple different times, so
It's
good.
going to be soon.
Good.
Again, yeah.
Yeah, it's really great. That's a good,
Casey and I are taking care of
What's
that.
it called?
the psychedelic experience. Yeah, it's really good. It's about
Don't they cure Baba Ramdas's homosexuality for 10 minutes? Don't they cure
Yeah.
Baba Ramdas's homosexuality for 10 minutes?
That's a topic for another day.
yeah, that is. We've reached the end. When that comes up, then
I
it's time
think he
to
went
wrap it
down
up.
on Timothy Leary.
I'm not getting worried.